Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into the vast and mysterious question of alien life, of UFOs drifting silently through our skies, of distant civilizations that may exist somewhere among the stars. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a quiet joy to see all the places we gather from, each of us in our own small corner of this immense universe. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft, steady hum, and let your body settle into stillness. And as we begin, if your mind starts to drift, that's perfectly fine. Let it wander gently. The story will continue softly, whether you follow every word or simply float alongside it. Tonight, we begin with something simple and something impossibly large: the night sky. There is a quiet moment just before sleep when the world becomes softer. The noise of the day fades, the sharp edges of thought begin to blur, and somewhere in that gentle stillness, your mind may wander upward, toward the sky. If you've ever looked up on a clear night, far from city lights, you may have noticed something curious. Not just the stars themselves, but the feeling they create. A sense that what you are seeing is not just distant, but deep, as though the sky is not a surface, but an ocean of light, stretching in all directions, with no visible shore. Each of those tiny points of light is not just a star, but something much larger, a sun, some smaller than our own, some far larger, each burning quietly in the darkness, often for billions of years, and around many of these stars there are worlds, planets. For a long time, humanity wondered whether planets were rare, perhaps even unique to our own solar system. But over the past few decades, something remarkable has happened. We have begun to find them, not one or two, but thousands. Worlds orbiting distant stars detected through subtle changes in light or gentle shifts in motion. Some are massive and hot, orbiting so close to their stars that their skies would glow with constant fire. Others are cold and distant, drifting slowly in the outer reaches of their systems, and somewhere in between, there are planets that sit at just the right distance, not too close, not too far, where temperatures may allow liquid water to exist, where conditions are, at least in principle, gentle enough for life. You might imagine this distance like sitting near a fire on a quiet night, too close, and the heat becomes overwhelming, too far, and the cold begins to creep in. But in that middle space there is comfort, and in the vastness of the universe there are many such places. More than we once believed possible. Some of these worlds are larger than Earth, what scientists softly call super-Earths, planets with stronger gravity, thicker atmospheres, perhaps even more stable environments. Others are covered almost entirely by oceans, deep, endless waters stretching across their entire surface. And then there are those that orbit stars slightly smaller and cooler than our Sun, where the light is softer and the stars themselves live longer, giving life more time to grow, adapt, and evolve. It is a quiet thought, but a powerful one. Earth may not be the only place where life could exist, and perhaps not even the best. If you follow this idea gently, without rushing, something begins to take shape. Not a conclusion, but a possibility. If there are billions of galaxies, and within each galaxy, billions of stars, and around many of those stars, planets, Then the number of possible worlds becomes almost impossible to hold in the mind. It slips beyond counting, like grains of sand on a shoreline that never ends. And among those countless worlds, it seems almost natural to wonder, could something be there? Not necessarily something like us, not cities, not voices, not even thoughts as we know them, but something alive, something that grows, adapts, responds, something that, in its own way, experiences the quiet unfolding of existence. For decades, scientists have searched for signs of such life, carefully, patiently, often in silence, listening for faint signals, observing distant atmospheres, watching for subtle patterns that might suggest something more than rock and gas. And so far, we have not found clear evidence of intelligent life beyond Earth. No confirmed voices, no unmistakable signals, no direct encounters, only hints, questions, and a growing sense of curiosity. And yet, the universe does not feel empty. Not in the way a silent room feels empty. It feels more like a forest at night, quiet, but full, still, but alive with possibilities that are not immediately visible. Perhaps the silence is not absence, perhaps it is simply distance, or timing, or something else entirely. And this is where the question begins to deepen. Because if the universe is so vast, and if the conditions for life appear in many places, then why do we not see it? Why do we not hear it? Why does the sky, for all its brilliance, remain so quiet? It is a question that has followed humanity for generations, a question that sits gently at the edge of science and philosophy and imagination. And as we continue this journey, drifting a little further into the cosmos, we will begin to explore not just where life might exist, but why it might remain hidden, or silent, or perhaps watching. But for now, there is no need to rush ahead. Let your thoughts linger here for a moment, in this quiet realization that the sky above you is not empty. It is simply very, very large, and somewhere within that vastness, the story may already be unfolding. Whether we can hear it yet is another question entirely. If you let your thoughts drift just a little further, beyond the familiar outline of Earth, beyond the quiet orbit of the Moon, you begin to enter a space where imagination and observation gently overlap. For most of human history, planets were little more than wandering lights in the sky, distant and unknowable. But now, with careful instruments and patient observation, we have begun to see them not as points of light, but as places, real places. Some of them orbit stars not so different from our own sun, while others circle stars that glow a little dimmer or burn a little hotter, casting their light in shades that would feel unfamiliar to us. And these worlds, they are not all the same. In fact, they are wonderfully, almost endlessly different. Some planets are enormous, many times the size of Earth. Their gravity would feel heavier, as though every movement carried a little more weight, like walking through water instead of air. Their skies might be thick and hazy, wrapped in layers of atmosphere that hold in warmth and protect the surface below. Others are smaller, quieter, with thin atmospheres and wide open skies. Worlds where the horizon stretches endlessly, and the stars might appear brighter, closer, more present. And then there are the ocean worlds, planets where water does not gather into oceans, but becomes the entire surface itself. Imagine standing on a world where there are no continents, no mountains, no dry land at all, just a vast, uninterrupted expanse of water gently moving beneath an endless sky. On such a world, life, if it exists, would grow differently. It would adapt to currents instead of winds, to depths instead of heights, Intelligence, if it emerged, might not build cities of stone or metal, but structures grown, shaped, or woven from living systems beneath the waves. It is a quiet reminder that life does not need to look like us to be real. Some of these distant planets orbit stars that are smaller and cooler than our Sun, stars that glow with a softer, warmer light. These stars can live much longer, sometimes for tens of billions of years, far longer than the lifetime of our own Sun. And with more time comes more opportunity, more time for simple chemistry to organise, more time for life to emerge, and perhaps more time for intelligence to slowly take shape. There is a gentle idea that has begun to take hold among scientists that Earth, while remarkable, may not be the most ideal place for life, not because it is lacking, but because it is only one version of what is possible. There may be worlds quietly orbiting distant stars that offer even more stable climates, richer environments, and longer uninterrupted periods for life to grow and evolve. These are sometimes imagined as super-habitable worlds, places where conditions are just slightly more forgiving, a little warmer, a little more humid, with thicker atmospheres that protect against radiation and environments that remain stable over immense stretches of time. On such a world, forests might stretch farther, oceans might remain calmer, and ecosystems might have millions or even billions of years to refine themselves. If life has had more time, it may also have had more chances to become complex, and complexity, over time, can lead to something else, something that begins to observe, to learn, to wonder. But even before we reach that point, there is something else to consider. Not every planet that looks suitable for life actually has life. This may seem like a small detail, but it is an important one. A planet might have liquid water, a stable atmosphere, and the right temperature, and still remain completely lifeless. In a quiet way, it might resemble a living world, without truly being one. Scientists sometimes think of this as a kind of false signal, a planet that appears from a distance, as though it might be alive, but is not. For example, certain gases, like oxygen or methane, can exist in a planet's atmosphere without being produced by life. They can form through natural geological processes, through interactions between rock, heat, and light. So when we look at a distant world, we're not just asking, does it look alive? We're asking something more careful, something more patient. Could there be another explanation? This is part of the quiet discipline of science, not rushing toward conclusions, but gently testing each possibility, allowing the truth, whatever it may be, to reveal itself slowly. And so, as we continue to observe these distant worlds, we are learning not just to look, but to listen more carefully, to notice the difference between what seems alive and what truly is. And this process, slow and uncertain as it may be, is guiding us toward a deeper understanding, not just of other worlds, but of our own. Because the more we learn about the conditions that allow life to exist, the more we begin to see how delicate and how rare those conditions may be. Earth, in its quiet balance of oceans, atmosphere, temperature, and time, begins to feel less like a default and more like a moment that could have been different, a moment that might not last forever. And yet, it is also a reminder that if such a moment has happened here, it may have happened elsewhere, perhaps many times, perhaps in forms we would recognize, or forms we would not. And so the question continues to unfold, not as a sudden realization, but as a soft, steady expansion of thought. If there are so many worlds, if so many of them seem capable of holding life, then somewhere, out there, there may be oceans we have never seen, skies we have never imagined, and perhaps beings who look up at their own stars and wonder in their own quiet way if they are alone. If you stay with this thought just a little longer, letting it settle gently rather than rushing ahead, a quieter question begins to emerge. Not just where life could exist, but what life actually needs. It is tempting to imagine that life requires something very specific, something rare and delicate, a perfect combination of ingredients that only happens once. But the truth, as we understand it so far, is both simpler and more mysterious. Life, at its most basic level, seems to need only a few things, not perfection, but possibility. First, there is the need for something to build with. On Earth, that something is chemistry, atoms joining together into molecules, molecules forming patterns, patterns becoming structures. Carbon, in particular, plays a quiet but important role. It has a natural ability to connect with many other elements, forming long, flexible chains, like a set of building blocks that can arrange themselves in countless ways. You might imagine it like a box of simple pieces that, given enough time, can assemble into something unexpectedly complex. Second, there is the need for a medium, a place where these interactions can happen freely. For us, that medium is water, not because water is magical, but because it allows things to move, to mix, to meet. It dissolves substances, carries energy, and creates an environment where reactions can unfold gently over time. It is less like a container and more like a stage, a place where chemistry can perform. Third, there is the need for energy. Life does not simply sit still. It transforms, grows, adapts, and to do that, it requires a steady flow of energy. On Earth, most of this energy comes from the sun, arriving as light and warmth, but in other environments, energy might come from different sources. Deep beneath the ocean, far from sunlight, there are places where life gathers around cracks in the Earth's crust, where heat rises from below. In these quiet, hidden environments, life does not depend on light at all, but on chemistry and heat, a reminder that life can be more adaptable than we might expect. And finally, there is something that is easy to overlook, but perhaps the most important of all: time. Not just years, but vast stretches of time, millions, even billions of years during which simple processes can repeat again and again, slowly building complexity. If you imagine life as a kind of pattern, then time is what allows that pattern to emerge. Without enough time, even the right ingredients may never come together. Now, when we look out at distant planets, these are the quiet things we search for. Not cities, not signals, not movement, but conditions. A world with liquid water, a stable environment, a gentle, continuous source of energy, and enough time for something to begin. But even when all of these conditions are present, something surprising remains. Life is not guaranteed. A planet can have everything that seems necessary and still remain silent, still, unchanged. This is one of the more humbling realizations in science, that the presence of possibility does not always lead to the presence of life. And so, when we search the skies, we must be careful. Because sometimes, a planet can give the appearance of life without truly being alive. Imagine looking at a distant world and noticing that its atmosphere contains oxygen. On Earth, oxygen is closely tied to life. It is produced by plants and microorganisms, quietly released into the air as a byproduct of living processes. So seeing oxygen elsewhere might feel like a sign, a clue, a quiet whisper that something is there. But oxygen can also form in other ways, through sunlight breaking apart molecules, through chemical reactions in rocks, through processes that have nothing to do with life at all. In this way, a planet can wear a kind of mask. It can resemble a living world without actually being one. The same is true for other gases, like methane. On Earth, methane is often associated with biological activity, with life processes unfolding quietly beneath the surface. But methane too can arise from purely natural interactions, from heat, pressure, and chemistry working together over time. And so, scientists do not look for a single signal. They look for patterns, combinations, changes over time. Because life, if it exists, tends to leave behind not just one sign, but many, interacting in subtle and consistent ways. It is less like finding a single footprint and more like noticing a trail, a sequence of small clues, each one alone uncertain, but together forming a quiet story. And even then, certainty comes slowly, carefully, because the universe is vast, and it has many ways of surprising us. There's also another gentle shift in perspective that begins to take shape here. Life, as we know it, is only one example, one expression of what is possible. We often imagine that life elsewhere would resemble life on Earth, at least in its basic structure, but this may not always be the case. There may be environments where chemistry unfolds differently, where energy flows in unfamiliar ways, where the very structure of life is not based on the same patterns we see here. Perhaps there are worlds where life does not depend on water, but on other liquids, worlds where temperatures are lower or higher, where the rhythm of existence moves at a different pace. Life in such places might not grow, or move, or perceive in ways we would recognize. It may exist quietly, slowly, almost imperceptibly, or it may be more dynamic, more fluid, shaped by forces we're only beginning to understand. This does not make it less real, only different. And so, as we continue to look outward, we carry with us both knowledge and humility. We know what life needs here. We know what signs it leaves behind. But we also know that our understanding is incomplete, that there may be forms of life and ways of being that do not fit neatly into our expectations, and perhaps, somewhere in the vastness we've begun to explore, there are worlds that meet all the conditions we recognize, and others that meet none of them, yet are alive in ways we cannot yet imagine. And this is where the quiet mystery deepens, because the question is no longer just, where could life exist, but something softer, something more open? What does it mean for something to be alive at all? As this quiet question continues to unfold, not as something urgent, but as something gently persistent, our attention begins to shift from wondering to searching. Because once you begin to ask whether something might exist, it becomes natural to ask how you would ever find it. And in a universe as vast as this, the search itself becomes something almost poetic. Not a loud exploration, but a quiet listening. Imagine for a moment standing alone in a dark field at night. No city lights, no noise, just a wide open sky stretching endlessly above you. And somewhere out there, you suspect there may be others, not close enough to see, not near enough to hear clearly, but present in some distant and unseen way. So what do? You listen. Not for voices exactly, but for patterns, for anything that feels intentional. This is in many ways what scientists have been doing for decades, not scanning the sky for ships or shapes, but listening for signals, very faint signals, signals that might travel across unimaginable distances, taking years or centuries or even longer to arrive. One of the most well-known efforts in this quiet search is often called the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. A long name, but a simple idea: to listen carefully for signs that somewhere, something is transmitting information. Using large radio telescopes, vast curved structures that resemble enormous listening dishes, scientists scan different regions of the sky. They're not looking for conversations, not at first. They're looking for something much simpler, a pattern that does not belong to nature. Because nature, for all its beauty, tends to follow certain rhythms. Stars emit light in steady ways. Galaxies rotate in predictable patterns. Cosmic noise has a kind of randomness to it. But a signal created by intelligence, even a simple one, often carries structure, repetition, order, a sequence that suggests intention. It might be something as subtle as a narrow band of radio waves, focused in a way that natural processes rarely produce, or a signal that pulses, not randomly, but with a steady, deliberate rhythm, like a distant lighthouse, turning slowly in the dark. And so, scientists listen, hour after hour, year after year, scanning different stars, different regions of the sky, collecting data that, at first glance, may seem almost indistinguishable from silence. But silence, in this context, is not empty. It is full of possibility. Because within that quiet, there may be signals so faint, so distant, that they are easily lost unless you know how to look. And this is where the search becomes more refined, because listening is only one part of the story. The other part is looking, not for objects, but for signs of activity, subtle changes, gentle hints that something is happening on a scale far beyond anything we have built. For example, imagine a civilization far more advanced than ours, one that has learned not just to use energy, but to gather it on an enormous scale. Around their star, they might build structures, not solid shells, but vast networks of objects, slowly orbiting, collecting light. From a distance, this might not look like a structure at all. It might simply appear as a star that dims slightly, or flickers in an unusual way. A star whose light is not steady, but softly interrupted, not randomly, but with a pattern, like sunlight passing through leaves, shifting gently, but not chaotically. And so, astronomers watch for these subtle changes, not expecting certainty, but looking for clues that something artificial, something constructed, might be present. There are also other ways to search. Some involve looking at the atmospheres of distant planets, not just for signs of life, but for signs of activity. Unusual combinations of gases, patterns that shift over time, hints that something is altering the environment in ways that are difficult to explain through natural processes alone. It is a careful process, one that requires patience and restraint, because the universe is complex and many things can appear unusual without being artificial. A strange signal may turn out to be a natural phenomenon. A flickering star may have a completely ordinary explanation, and so every possibility is tested, gently, repeatedly, until only the most consistent explanations remain. There is also a quieter idea, one that adds another layer to this search, that we may not only find active civilizations, but traces, remnants, signs that something once existed and is no longer there. Imagine discovering a structure, orbiting a distant star, not active, not transmitting, but still present, a silent artifact, a reminder that, at some point in the past, something was built, something existed, long enough to leave a mark, This kind of discovery would be different, less like hearing a voice and more like finding a footprint, a trace of something that has already passed. And in a universe where time stretches across billions of years, it is possible that many civilizations have come and gone long before we began to look. So the search continues in many forms, listening, watching, measuring, comparing, not with urgency, but with quiet persistence. Because in a universe this large, the answer, whatever it may be, is unlikely to arrive suddenly. It will emerge slowly, through patterns, through careful observation, through moments where something does not quite fit and invites a closer look, and perhaps, somewhere in all that data, all that quiet listening, there's already something waiting to be noticed. Not a clear message, not a direct signal, but a subtle shift, a small irregularity, a whisper that does not belong to the natural rhythm of the cosmos. And as we continue to refine our instruments and deepen our understanding, we move slowly, gently, toward the possibility that one day the silence might begin to change. As this quiet search continues, not as a race, but as a slow unfolding, something subtle begins to shift in how we imagine intelligence itself. Because when we think of finding another civilization, it is easy to picture something familiar, a signal, a message, perhaps even a voice. But in a universe this vast and across distances so great, intelligence may not appear in such direct ways. It may not speak. It may not announce itself. Instead, it may leave behind traces, quiet, enormous traces, woven into the structure of its surroundings. To understand this idea, it helps to begin with something simple: energy. Every civilization, no matter how small or advanced, depends on energy. To build, to grow, to sustain itself, it must gather and use the energy available in its environment. Here on Earth, we rely on a fraction of the energy that reaches us from the sun, a gentle flow of light and warmth, enough to sustain life, but still only a small portion of what our star provides. Now imagine, slowly, a civilization that begins to grow, not rapidly, not dramatically, but steadily, over thousands or millions of years. Its needs increase, its technology becomes more refined, and over time, it learns to gather more of the energy from its star. At first, perhaps, this happens through simple means: capturing sunlight, storing it, using it more efficiently. But eventually, the scale begins to change. Instead of collecting energy on the surface of a planet, this civilization may begin to build structures in space, objects that orbit their star, quietly intercepting its light, not as a single solid shell, but as countless individual pieces, like a cloud, slowly forming around the star. From a distance, this would not look like a machine. It would not resemble anything familiar. Instead, the star itself would begin to change. Its light might appear slightly dimmer, as though something were gently filtering it, not blocking it entirely, but softening it, in a way that feels almost natural, and yet not quite, like sunlight passing through a thin veil, or through drifting mist. And if you watched carefully, over time, you might notice that the dimming is not random. It follows patterns, subtle but consistent. This idea of a civilization surrounding its star with energy-collecting structures is sometimes imagined as a kind of stellar ecosystem, a network quietly harvesting light, converting it into usable energy. Not a single object, but a system, a presence, rather than a structure. And while we have never confirmed the existence of such a system, we've begun to look for signs of it. astronomers study the light from distant stars, watching for small, unusual variations, moments when the brightness dips, not in the smooth, predictable way caused by a passing planet, but in more complex patterns that invite curiosity, not immediate conclusions, but careful attention, because the universe is full of surprises, and not all surprises are artificial. Sometimes, a star may behave strangely for entirely natural reasons: dust clouds, swirling debris, interactions with nearby objects. All of these can create unusual patterns of light, and so, as always, the search remains patient. Observations are repeated, compared, tested against different possibilities until only the most consistent explanations remain. But even the act of looking changes something. It expands the way we think, because it suggests that intelligence, on a sufficiently large scale, might not be hidden. It might be visible, not as a being, but as an effect, a gentle reshaping of energy, of light, of structure. There are other possibilities as well. Imagine a civilization that has moved beyond its home planet entirely, one that lives in vast habitats, floating quietly in space, not anchored to a surface, but drifting in stable orbits, carefully designed to provide everything needed for life. These habitats might rotate slowly, creating a sense of gravity, allowing inhabitants to walk, to build, to live in environments that feel familiar, even far from any planet. From a distance, such structures might appear as small points of reflected light, moving in patterns that do not quite match natural orbits, subtle but detectable. And then there are more distant possibilities, civilizations that leave behind traces, not because they are active, but because they once were. Imagine discovering a region of space where something does not quite fit, an object or a collection of objects that do not behave like natural formations, not emitting signals, not changing, simply existing, silent, like ruins, in the vastness of space. This idea carries a different feeling, not excitement, but quiet reflection, because it suggests that even if we don't find living civilizations, we may still find evidence that they existed, that somewhere, at some point, intelligence arose, built, and eventually faded, leaving behind only the faintest traces. And in a universe that is more than 13 billion years old, this possibility becomes difficult to ignore. Civilizations may not last forever. Stars evolve, planets change, environments shift, time moves forward, slowly, but without pause. And so, what we see when we look into the distance is not just space, it is history, light that has travelled for years, centuries, even millions of years, carrying with it information about what once was. When we observe a distant star, we are not seeing it as it is now, we are seeing it as it was. And if a civilization existed around that star long ago, its traces, if they remain, would arrive to us in the same way, quietly, delayed, like a message that has taken a very long journey. And so, the search continues, not just for voices, but for echoes, not just for presence, but for patterns, for the gentle ways in which intelligence might leave its mark, even across the vast distances of space and time. And perhaps, as we continue to look and listen and learn, we will begin to recognize something subtle, a shift in the rhythm of the universe, a pattern that does not belong to nature alone, a quiet indication that somewhere beyond the reach of our immediate senses, something has been there and in its own way still is. As this quiet search stretches outward, across stars and distant worlds, it can be easy to forget something closer, something much nearer, our own sky. Because while scientists have been listening to the distant universe, there have also been moments, brief, puzzling moments, when something unusual appears much closer to home, not in deep space, but here, within Earth's atmosphere. For decades, people have reported seeing objects in the sky that do not behave in familiar ways. Lights that move too quickly, shapes that change direction without slowing, objects that seem to hover silently and then vanish. At first, many of these reports were simple: a distant light, an unfamiliar motion, something glimpsed for only a few seconds before disappearing into the night. But over time, something changed. The observations became more detailed, more consistent, and in some cases, more difficult to explain. Pilots, trained observers, accustomed to reading the sky, began to report encounters with objects that did not behave like conventional aircraft. Objects that moved against strong winds, without visible propulsion. Objects that accelerated smoothly, without the gradual build-up of speed we would normally expect. You might imagine an airplane turning in the sky. It banks gently, adjusts its angle, follows a curved path. But some of these reported objects appear to move differently. They shift direction abruptly, as though momentum does not affect them in the usual way. They accelerate, not in stages, but almost instantly, like a thought, rather than a machine. Some reports describe objects that seem to move seamlessly between air and water, diving beneath the surface of the ocean and then rising again, without visible disturbance, as though the boundary between sky and sea does not apply to them. In recent years, some of these encounters have been recorded. Infrared cameras mounted on aircraft have captured brief sequences of unusual motion, small, distant shapes, moving steadily or rapidly crossing the frame. Pilots' voices, calm but surprised, can sometimes be heard, noting the speed, the direction, the unexpected nature of what they're seeing. These recordings have been studied carefully, analysed, reviewed, compared against known technologies and natural explanations, and in many cases, explanations have been found. Optical effects, sensor limitations, distant aircraft, atmospheric conditions. The sky is a complex place, and perception, especially at high speed and great distance, can be more fragile than we might expect. But not all cases are resolved. Some remain open, not confirmed as anything extraordinary, but not fully explained either. And this is where it becomes important to pause and approach the question gently, because the presence of something unexplained does not necessarily mean the presence of something unknown in the way we might imagine. It does not immediately point to extraterrestrial visitors. It does not confirm advanced technologies beyond our understanding. It simply tells us something quieter, that our observations are incomplete, that there are moments when what we see does not fully align with what we expect. In science, this is not unusual. It is in fact part of the process. The world and the universe is full of phenomena that take time to understand. Some are resolved quickly, others remain uncertain for longer. And so, instead of rushing to conclusions, scientists use a different approach. They gather more data, they refine instruments, they improve observation methods, because often what appears mysterious at first becomes clearer over time. There is also another possibility to consider, that some of these observations may involve technologies developed here on Earth, but not widely known. Throughout history, advanced aircraft have often been misunderstood when first observed. Shapes that seemed unfamiliar, movements that appeared unusual, technologies that were ahead of what the public expected. It is not difficult to imagine how something new, something experimental, might appear extraordinary, especially when seen from a distance. And yet, even with all of these explanations, the curiosity remains, because the question is not only about what these objects are, it is also about what they represent. They remind us that even in our immediate surroundings, there are still things we do not fully understand, that the boundary between the known and the unknown is not fixed. It shifts, slowly, as knowledge expands, and perhaps most importantly, they invite us to stay curious, not in a way that leaps to conclusions, but in a way that remains open, thoughtful, willing to explore, without needing immediate answers. Because whether these objects turn out to be natural phenomena, human technology, or something else entirely, they serve a quiet purpose. They remind us that the sky, even now, is not completely familiar, that there are still moments when something moves across it, and we pause and wonder, not with certainty, but with a kind of quiet attention. And as we continue to look outward, toward distant stars and possible civilizations, it is worth remembering that mystery does not only exist far away. Sometimes it passes quietly above us, seen for just a moment, before disappearing once again into the vast open sky. If you let your thoughts drift just a little further into the vastness we've been exploring, something begins to feel almost unavoidable. Not a conclusion, not a certainty, but a quiet sense of expectation, because everything we have seen so far gently points in the same direction. There are countless stars. Around many of those stars as there are planets, and among those planets, some appear to have the right conditions for life. This alone is enough to begin forming a simple, almost natural idea. That life may not be rare. But to understand this more clearly, it helps to imagine a kind of mental map. Not a map of places, but a map of possibilities. Scientists have over time tried to sketch such a map, not to arrive at a final answer, but to organize the question, to ask step by step. How likely is it that somewhere out there, something has begun to live, to think, to wonder? You might imagine this map not as a formula, but as a series of quiet questions. How many stars are there? Of those stars, how many have planets? Of those planets, how many might offer conditions where life could begin? And from those, how many actually develop life? Then, how many of those living worlds eventually give rise to something more complex, something that begins to observe, to build, to send signals into the dark? Each step does not give a precise number. Instead, it narrows the path, like walking through a forest, where each clearing leads to another, smaller one, until eventually you arrive at a place where the question becomes very quiet. How many civilizations might be out there right now? We do not yet know, but what we do know gently shapes the expectation. We now understand that stars are not rare. Our own galaxy alone, the Milky Way, is home to hundreds of billions of them. And beyond our galaxy, there are countless others, each with their own collection of stars and worlds. If even a small fraction of those stars have planets, and even a small fraction of those planets can support life, then the number of potential living worlds becomes very large, almost too large to fully imagine. But there is something else, something just as important: time. Life on Earth began relatively early in our planet's history. Within a few 100 million years after the surface cooled, simple forms of life had already appeared, not complex, not intelligent, but alive. And from that beginning, over billions of years, life slowly changed. It adapted, diversified, became more intricate. Eventually, after an immense stretch of time, something new emerged. Awareness, the ability to reflect, to question, to look up at the sky and wonder. If this process happened here, it suggests something quiet but powerful. That, given the right conditions and enough time, life may not only begin, it may continue, and over time, it may grow more complex. Now consider this. The universe itself is incredibly old. It has existed for more than 13 billion years, a span of time so vast that even slow processes have had more than enough opportunity to unfold. Our Sun, by comparison, is younger. Earth is younger still, which means that elsewhere in the universe, there may be stars and planets that formed long before ours, worlds where life, if it began, has had far more time to develop. Not just thousands or millions of years ahead, but perhaps millions of years beyond our current stage. It is a quiet realization, but one that shifts perspective. If intelligent life can emerge, and if time allows it to continue, then there may already be civilizations that are far older, far more advanced than anything we can currently imagine. Not everywhere, not on every world, but somewhere, and perhaps in many places. At this point, the expectation becomes difficult to ignore, because the ingredients seem common, the conditions not impossible, the time available more than sufficient, and so the idea begins to settle, not as a bold claim, but as a gentle conclusion. The universe should be alive, not necessarily crowded and not filled with voices in every direction, but alive, with scattered points of awareness, separated by vast distances, each unfolding its own story, each shaped by its own environment, its own history, its own path through time. You might imagine them as distant lights, not just of stars, but of thought, small, quiet centers of experience spread across the darkness. Some may be simple, barely more than microbial life, others, perhaps more complex, exploring their surroundings, building, learning, and somewhere it is possible that there are civilizations who have already looked outward, just as we're doing now, who have asked the same question, who have listened, waited, wondered, and yet, as this expectation gently takes shape, something else begins to emerge alongside it, a quiet tension. Because if the universe should be alive, if there should be voices scattered across the stars, then why does everything still feel so silent? Why, when we listen, do we hear nothing clear? Why, when we look, do we find only hints and possibilities, but no confirmation? It is not a loud contradiction. It does not arrive suddenly. It is more like a subtle imbalance, a thought that does not quite settle, like expecting to hear distant music and finding only stillness. And this is where the question deepens, not louder, but more quietly, more thoughtfully, because now the mystery is no longer just about possibility, it is about absence. And as we continue, allowing this thought to unfold at its own pace, we begin to approach one of the most intriguing questions in all of science. Not whether life could exist, but why, if it does, it remains so difficult to find. As this expectation settles in, not sharply, but like a slow, quiet realization, something begins to feel slightly out of place, not dramatically wrong, not alarming, just incomplete. Because if the universe truly holds so many possibilities for life, if the ingredients are common and the time has been abundant, then it becomes natural to expect something else. Not certainty, but presence, a signal, a trace, a sign that somewhere, Beyond the distance, something has already begun to speak, and yet, when we listen, there is only silence. Not absolute silence, of course. The universe is full of sound in its own way. Bursts of radiation, distant pulses from stars, the steady hum of cosmic background energy. But none of it carries intention. None of it feels like a message. None of it clearly says, "We are here." And so the contrast begins to emerge. On one side, a universe that seems rich with possibility. On the other, a sky that remains quietly still. This contrast has been noticed before, not as a dramatic discovery, but as a simple question. A question once asked by a physicist named Enrico Fermi. In the middle of an ordinary conversation, he paused and asked something that has echoed ever since. Where is everybody? It is such a simple question, almost casual, and yet it carries within it a deep and subtle tension, because it does not ask whether life is possible. It assumes that it is. Instead, it asks why, if life is possible, and perhaps even likely. We do not see it, do not hear it, do not encounter it. This quiet contradiction has come to be known as the Fermi Paradox, but it is not a paradox in the sense of something impossible. It is more like a gap, a space between what we expect and what we observe, and the longer we look, the more noticeable that space becomes. Imagine walking through a vast forest. You know that life exists there. You can see the trees, feel the wind, notice the movement of leaves. You might expect to hear birds, insects, distant calls echoing softly through the branches, but instead, everything is still. No sound, no movement, just a quiet, unbroken silence. At first, it might feel peaceful, but over time, it begins to feel unusual, not frightening, just unfamiliar, as though something that should be there is missing. This is the feeling the Fermi Paradox creates, not fear, but a kind of quiet confusion, because the universe does not appear empty. It appears capable, full of potential, and yet when we search for signs of intelligence, we find nothing that is clear, no signals that stand apart from natural processes, no structures that can be confirmed as artificial, no direct evidence that another civilization has reached out or left a mark we can unmistakably recognize. It is as though we are standing in a vast cosmic landscape, waiting for an echo that never quite arrives. There are, of course, possibilities. Perhaps we've simply not been looking long enough. Our search, in the grand scale of time, has only just begun. A few decades of listening, against billions of years of cosmic history. It would be like arriving at the shore of a great ocean, listening for a moment, and concluding that no waves exist. Or perhaps we're looking in the wrong way, listening for signals in forms we understand, while other civilizations may communicate differently, using methods we have not yet discovered, or signals so subtle or so advanced that they blend seamlessly into the background of the universe. There is also the question of timing. Even if civilizations are scattered across the stars, they may not exist at the same time. One might rise, flourish, and fade long before another begins, separated not only by distance, just the eras, like voices calling out, but never overlapping, never meeting. And so the silence remains, not absolute, but persistent, a quiet backdrop against which all our expectations rest. And in that silence, something begins to shift, because the question is no longer just, are we alone? It becomes something more reflective, more subtle. If others exist, why do we not see them? It is a question that does not demand an immediate answer. It invites patience, curiosity, a willingness to sit with uncertainty, because the silence itself may be telling us something, not loudly, not clearly, but gently, as though the universe is offering a riddle, not to confuse us, but to guide us toward deeper understanding. And as we continue this quiet exploration, allowing each idea to unfold at its own pace, we begin to consider possibilities that are not immediately obvious, possibilities that do not remove the silence, but help us understand it, because perhaps the universe is not empty, perhaps it is not silent by accident, perhaps there is a reason. As this quiet question lingers, not demanding an answer, but gently opening space for reflection, another possibility begins to take shape. Not that the universe is empty, not that civilizations never emerged, but something softer, something more subtle, that perhaps they are there and we simply cannot hear them. At first, this idea may seem almost too simple, but if we follow it slowly, it begins to unfold into something deeper. Because the universe is not just large, it is vast, in a way that stretches far beyond everyday experience. Distances between stars are not measured in kilometers or miles, but in the time it takes for light to travel. Light, moving at its natural, unchanging speed, crosses enormous distances, but even so, the journey is long. The nearest star beyond our sun is a little over 4 years away, if you could travel at the speed of light itself. And most stars are much farther, hundreds, thousands, even millions of light years apart, which means that when we look into the sky, we are not seeing things as they are now. We're seeing them as they were. Light from a distant star may have begun its journey long before human civilization existed, long before our species had even taken its current form. So if a civilization exists around that star today, we may not yet see it. And if a civilization existed there long ago, its signals may have already passed us by, unnoticed. In this way, the universe is not just a vast space. It is a layered history, a quiet archive of moments spread across time. Now imagine that somewhere on a distant world, a civilization begins to transmit signals, not powerful beams, not grand announcements, but simple, steady emissions. Perhaps similar to the radio signals we have sent into space. These signals travel outward, spreading gently in all directions, but as they move farther from their source, they become weaker, more diffuse, like ripples in a still pond, expanding outward until they are no longer visible. By the time such a signal reaches another star system, it may be incredibly faint, so faint that even with our most sensitive instruments, it blends into the natural background. Lost, not because it does not exist, but because it has become too subtle to distinguish. There is also the question of direction. Signals sent into space do not necessarily reach everywhere. They spread, but not always evenly. A civilization might transmit in ways that are focused, aimed at specific regions, or simply not directed toward us at all. In that case, even if signals exist, we may never encounter them, like standing in a quiet room, while someone speaks softly in another, just beyond the range of hearing. There's also the matter of time. Civilizations, if they arise, may not last indefinitely. They may exist for thousands or millions of years, and then change or fade. And if two civilizations exist at different times, they may never overlap. One may send signals long before the other has developed the ability to receive them, or one may begin listening long after the signals have already passed. It is like two voices calling out across a vast distance, but never at the same moment, never aligning, never meeting. And then there is something even more subtle, the possibility that other civilizations do communicate, but not in ways we recognize. We often imagine communication in familiar forms: radio waves, light pulses, structured signals. But this is shaped by our own understanding, our own technology. Another civilization, especially one far more advanced, may use methods that are entirely different. Signals embedded in forms of energy we have not yet learned to detect. Patterns hidden within phenomena we currently interpret as natural. Or communication that does not rely on transmission at all, but on principles we do not yet understand. It is a quiet reminder that our search is limited not only by distance, but by perception. We are listening with the tools we have, shaped by the knowledge we possess. And while those tools are growing more refined, they are still young, still learning, still expanding. There is also the possibility that advanced civilizations simply do not broadcast, that they have moved beyond the need to send signals outward. Perhaps they communicate in ways that are localized, efficient, private, or perhaps they have learned that broadcasting into the vastness of space is unnecessary, or even unwise. In such a case, the universe could be full of activity, but remain quiet, not because there is nothing there, but because what is there is not meant to be heard from afar. And so, the silence we observe may not be true silence. It may be something closer to distance, or timing, or difference. Like standing at the edge of a vast ocean at night. You know the water is moving, that currents flow beneath the surface, that life exists in abundance below. But from where you stand, everything appears still, quiet, unmoving. Not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening is beyond your immediate perception. And so the question shifts once more, not disappearing, but softening, from where is everyone, to something more patient, more open. Are they already there, just beyond our reach? And as we continue, gently following this line of thought, another possibility begins to emerge. Not that we cannot hear them, but that there may be reasons why they are not trying to be heard at all. As this possibility settles in, not that we cannot hear them, but that they may not be trying to be heard, another idea begins to emerge, one that feels both familiar and quietly unsettling, not because it is frightening, but because it changes the way we see ourselves. What if the silence is not caused by distance or limitation, but by choice? What if, somewhere in the vastness of the universe, there are civilizations that are fully aware of others, including us, and yet they choose not to interfere, not to reveal themselves, not to make contact? At first, this idea might feel distant, almost abstract. But if we bring it closer, it becomes easier to understand. Imagine walking through a natural reserve, a quiet forest, filled with life. Animals move through the trees, following their own patterns, their own rhythms. As an observer, you can watch them, study their behavior, learn from them, but you do not step in. You do not interrupt their environment, because doing so would change it, disturb it, perhaps even harm it. And so, you remain at distance, present, but unseen. This gentle analogy forms the heart of what is sometimes called the zoo hypothesis, the idea that advanced civilizations may observe younger ones, without interfering, allowing them to develop naturally, to grow, to learn, to make their own discoveries. In this view, Earth is not isolated. It is simply undisturbed, like a small island in a much larger ocean, watched, perhaps, but not approached. Not yet. There are many reasons such a choice might be made. One of them is preservation. Introducing advanced knowledge or technology too early could disrupt the natural development of a civilization. It could create imbalance, dependence, or even conflict. History, even on Earth, offers quiet reminders of what can happen when vastly different cultures meet. The more advanced group does not always intend harm, but the impact can still be profound, and not always in ways that can be reversed. So perhaps a more advanced civilization would choose patience, observation over intervention, waiting until a civilization reaches a certain level of understanding, a certain stability, before making contact. There is also the question of readiness, not just technological readiness, but emotional and social readiness. Would we, as a species, respond calmly to the confirmation that we are not alone? Would we unite or divide? Would curiosity guide us, or fear? These are not easy questions, and perhaps they are not ours to answer alone. Another possibility is that observation itself is the purpose, not as an experiment, but as a form of learning. Just as we study ecosystems, climates, patterns of life, another civilization might study the emergence of intelligence, the way awareness develops, the choices it makes, the paths it follows. In such a case, remaining unseen would be essential, because observation, to be meaningful, must not alter what is being observed. A delicate balance, a quiet presence. There is also a more subtle version of this idea. That contact may not be entirely absent, but indirect, not through clear messages or visible appearances, but through small, almost imperceptible influences. Moments of inspiration, shifts in understanding, gentle nudges that guide without revealing their source. This is, of course, more speculative, but it reflects a deeper thought. That interaction does not always need to be direct to exist. And yet, even without such possibilities, the core idea remains that the universe may not be silent because it is empty, but because those who could speak choose not to. If this is true, then the silence we observe is not a lack of presence, but a form of restraint, a quiet agreement, perhaps shared among civilizations, to allow each world to unfold in its own way, its own time, its own path. There is something strangely peaceful in this thought, not lonely, but respectful. A universe where intelligence exists, but does not impose, where observation replaces interference, where patience replaces urgency. And yet, beneath that calm, there's also a subtle tension, because if such observers exist, then the boundary between being alone and being watched becomes very thin, not in a way that demands fear, but in a way that invites reflection. How would we behave if we knew we were being observed? Would we act differently? Would we strive to be better? Or would we simply continue as we are? These questions do not have immediate answers, and perhaps they are not meant to. They are part of a larger unfolding, a quiet exploration of not just what exists beyond us, but what it means to exist at all. And as this idea settles gently into place, another possibility begins to form alongside it. Because observation is only one way a civilization might respond to others. There is another, more cautious, more hidden, not watching openly, but remaining concealed, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. As this idea of quiet observation settles in, gentle, patient, almost reassuring, another possibility begins to emerge alongside it, one that carries a different feeling, not louder, not more dramatic, but heavier, more cautious. Because what if the silence is not only a matter of choice, but of necessity? What if it is not simply that civilizations choose not to reveal themselves, but that they must not? Imagine for a moment a vast forest at night, not a peaceful forest, but one where every movement matters, where every sound carries, where every presence is noticed. In such a place, survival depends not on being seen, but on remaining hidden. Every creature moves carefully, not announcing itself, not calling out into the dark, because to be noticed is to risk being found, and to be found is to face something unknown. This quiet, cautious picture forms the heart of what is often called the dark forest hypothesis. The idea that the universe, though vast and filled with possibility, may also be a place where civilizations remain silent, because revealing their presence could be dangerous, not necessarily because others are hostile, but because intentions are unknown, and uncertainty in such a vast and distant environment cannot easily be resolved. If you imagine two civilizations separated by thousands of light years, they cannot meet easily. They cannot communicate in real time. A message sent takes years or centuries to arrive, and any reply takes just as long to return. In such a situation, trust becomes difficult, understanding uncertain. And so, a quiet question arises. If you detect another civilization, how do you know what it intends? Is it curious, peaceful, indifferent? Or does it see you as a potential threat or a resource? The truth is, from such a distance you may not know, and without knowing, even a small risk may feel significant, because the scale is so large, the consequences potentially irreversible. So, instead of reaching out, a civilization might choose silence, not out of fear, but out of caution, a quiet decision to remain unseen, unheard, to exist without drawing attention. This idea is not about constant conflict. It is not about an active struggle. It is something quieter, more restrained, a kind of mutual uncertainty shared across the stars, where each civilization, aware of the possibility of others, chooses to remain still, to observe, but not reveal, to listen, but not respond. In this view, the universe is not empty. It is simply careful, filled with civilizations that have learned, through experience or reasoning, that silence may be the safest path. There is also another layer to this thought, one that adds a deeper kind of tension, because even if most civilizations are peaceful, it only takes one, that is not, to make caution necessary. If even a single advanced civilization, somewhere in the universe, were capable of harming others or expanding aggressively, then any other civilization, no matter how peaceful, would need to consider that possibility, not as a certainty, but as a risk. And when distances are vast and communication is slow, there is no easy way to verify intentions, no quick conversation, no immediate reassurance, only signals, arriving long after they were sent, with no guarantee of meaning, and so silence becomes a strategy, not a sign of absence, but of awareness, a quiet understanding that in a universe where information travels slowly and consequences unfold over immense scales, it may be wiser to remain hidden. There is something strangely calm about this idea. It does not suggest chaos. It does not describe constant danger. Instead, it presents a universe where civilizations act carefully, where decisions are made slowly, where restraint becomes a form of intelligence, and yet it also carries a subtle weight, because if this is true, then the silence we observe is not accidental. It is intentional, not a gap, but a pattern, a shared behavior, across civilizations that have reached a certain level of understanding. You might imagine it like a quiet agreement, unspoken but followed, a kind of cosmic etiquette. Do not announce yourself, do not reveal your location. Listen, observe, but remain still. And if all civilizations follow this pattern, then the universe would appear exactly as it does, vast, active, full of potential, and yet silent. Not because no one is there, but because everyone is listening, and no one is speaking. This perspective does not claim to be true. It is one possibility among many, a way of interpreting the silence rather than explaining it completely. But it offers something valuable, a shift in how we understand the absence of signals, not as emptiness, but as restraint. And as we sit with this idea, allowing it to settle without urgency, another thought begins to emerge, because silence and caution are not the only outcomes. There's another possibility, one that is quieter still, that civilizations may not remain hidden or silent, but may simply no longer be there at all. As this idea of silence as a choice begins to settle, calm, cautious, almost deliberate, another possibility slowly comes into view. Not that civilizations are hiding, not that they are watching, but something more final, that they were here, and now they are not. At first, this thought feels distant, almost abstract, but if you follow it gently, without resistance, it begins to take on a different shape, because throughout the history of our own planet, life has not been constant. It has changed dramatically, many times. Entire ecosystems have appeared, flourished, and then quietly disappeared. Species that once dominated the Earth now exist only as traces, fossils, impressions, fragments of something that was once alive and is no longer. If this can happen on a single planet, then perhaps something similar happens on a much larger scale, across planets, across star systems, across the entire universe. This idea is sometimes described in a very simple way, as a kind of filter, not a physical barrier, not a visible boundary, but a process, a series of challenges that life must pass through in order to continue. Some of these steps may be relatively gentle, the transition from simple chemistry to living cells, from single-celled life to more complex organisms, from instinct to awareness. Each step takes time, patience, stability. But there may be other steps, more difficult, moments where progress becomes fragile, where survival is no longer guaranteed, moments where something must go right, or everything quietly ends. This is often referred to as the Great Filter, not as a single event, but as a collection of thresholds, points along the path of development, where many civilizations may stop, not by choice, but by circumstance. And if this is true, then the silence we observe may not be because civilizations never existed, but because many of them did not continue. To understand this more gently, it can help to imagine a distant world, a planet orbiting a quiet star, far from anything we could easily observe. On this world, life emerges, slowly. Over time, it becomes more complex. Creatures evolve, ecosystems form, intelligence begins to take shape. Eventually, a civilization arises. It learns to build, to understand its environment, to explore. Perhaps it begins to look outward, just as we're doing now. For a time, everything continues. Growth, discovery, progress. But then, something changes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. An imbalance appears, perhaps in the environment, perhaps in the use of resources, perhaps in the structures of the civilization itself, and over time, that imbalance grows, until one day, the systems that once supported life begin to fail. The atmosphere changes, the climate shifts, or perhaps something arrives from beyond, a wandering object passing silently through space, altering the delicate balance of the planet. The result is not immediate destruction, but a slow fading. Ecosystems weaken, populations decline, structures fall into disuse, and eventually the civilization disappears, not with a final signal, not with a message, but with silence. And over longer stretches of time, even the traces begin to fade. Weather, erosion, natural processes quietly reshape the surface. New forms of life may emerge, unaware of what came before, or the planet may remain still, carrying only faint scattered remnants. From a distance, it would appear unchanged, just another world, orbiting its star, no visible sign that anything had ever been there. This quiet scenario may not be rare. In a universe that spans billions of years, even civilizations that last for millions of years are brief, moments, small intervals in a much larger timeline. And so, if civilizations rise and fall across different times and places, then the chances of two existing at the same time, close enough to detect each other, become smaller, not impossible, but less likely. It is like watching the surface of a calm lake at night. Ripples appear, spread, and then fade. If you arrive at the wrong moment, you may see only still water, not because nothing has happened, but because what happened has already passed. This perspective shifts the question once more, from where is everyone to something quieter. Who was here before us? And perhaps more importantly, how many never made it this far? Because the great filter does not necessarily lie behind us. It may not be something that life has already passed. It could lie ahead, in challenges we have not yet encountered, decisions not yet made, paths not yet taken. This is not a thought meant to create fear. It is a reminder that existence, especially at the level of a civilization, is not guaranteed. It depends on balance, on adaptability, on the ability to navigate both internal and external change. And in that sense, the silence of the universe becomes something more than a mystery. It becomes a reflection, a quiet suggestion that survival on a cosmic scale is something rare, something delicate. And as we continue this journey, moving gently through these possibilities, another layer begins to unfold, because if civilizations can disappear, not only through internal challenges, but through forces far beyond their control, then the universe itself may play a role in shaping what remains. As this thought settles in, that civilizations may not only fade from within, but also be shaped by forces far beyond their control, our attention begins to shift once more, not outward, toward distant possibilities, but upward, toward the sky itself. Because the same sky that offers warmth, light, and the steady rhythm of day and night also carries within it a quiet unpredictability, not in the sense of sudden chaos, but in the slow, inevitable movement of things, far larger than any single world. Let us begin with something small, or at least something that appears small, a fragment of rock drifting silently through space. It may have been travelling for millions of years, following a path shaped by gravity, passing through the quiet darkness between planets. Most of the time, such objects pass unnoticed. They move quietly, far from any world, but sometimes Their path changes, a slight shift, a gentle nudge from a nearby planet, or a distant gravitational pull, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, their course begins to align with something else, a planet. At first, there is no urgency. The object is still far away, its motion steady, predictable, almost calm, but over time, the distance closes, and eventually, it arrives. Not as an explosion, not as a sudden moment of violence, but as a release of energy that the surface of a planet is not prepared to absorb. The atmosphere warms, dust rises, light fades slightly. As particles spread through the air, temperatures shift, not instantly, but gradually. Ecosystems begin to adjust, then strain, then weaken. Life doesn't disappear all at once, it changes. Some forms adapt, others do not. And over time, what once felt stable begins to feel different, less certain. This is one way a world can change, not suddenly, but through a slow loss of balance, and it is not the only way. There is another influence, quieter still, and far more constant, the star itself. Stars are often thought of as steady, unchanging sources of light, and in many ways, they are. They shine for billions of years, providing the energy that sustains life, but they are not completely still. They shift, subtly. Their activity rises and falls. Occasionally, they release bursts of energy, not in a dramatic flash, but in waves flowing outward through space. When such a wave reaches a planet, it interacts first with the atmosphere. Particles, moving at incredible speeds, gently press against the protective layers that surround the world. Most of the time, the atmosphere absorbs this energy, deflects it, shields the surface below. But if the energy becomes too strong or too frequent, that protective balance can begin to change. The upper layers of the atmosphere may slowly thin, molecules drift away, carried into space. Over long periods of time, the air itself becomes lighter, more fragile, less able to support the systems that depend on it. This is not something that happens in a moment. It unfolds quietly, gradually, like a slow breath, becoming shallower over time. And then there is something even more delicate, the balance of temperature. Life, as we know it, exists within a narrow range of conditions, not too hot, not too cold, a gentle equilibrium, maintained over long stretches of time. But this balance is not fixed, it can shift. Small changes in energy, in atmospheric composition, in the way heat is distributed across a planet, can slowly alter the climate. Oceans may warm or cool, ice may expand or retreat. Patterns that once felt stable begin to drift. At first, these changes may be subtle, barely noticeable, but over time they accumulate, and eventually the environment that once supported life becomes less welcoming, not hostile, but different. And sometimes, difference is enough. This is perhaps one of the most important realizations, that life does not require catastrophe to be challenged. It can be affected by slow change, by gradual imbalance, by the quiet shifting of conditions, over time. And for a civilization built upon those conditions, such changes can be profound, not because they arrive suddenly, but because they unfold slowly, across generations. Adapting becomes more difficult. Resources shift, systems strain, and the path forward becomes less certain. There is something deeply humbling in this, because it reminds us that even in a universe that appears calm and steady, there are forces at work, not hostile, not intentional, but vast, unavoidable, moving on timescales far beyond human experience. And these forces do not target, they do not choose, they simply act according to the quiet rules of physics, shaping worlds as they move. Some planets remain stable for long periods, others change. And in those changes, the story of life can shift, pause, or end, not with a final moment, but with a gradual fading. And yet, even within this fragility, there is something remarkable, because life, where it exists, often finds ways to endure, to adapt, to persist, not always, but sometimes. And in those moments of persistence, something new can emerge, new forms, new balances, new ways of existing within a changing environment. But even this resilience has limits, because there are forces, larger still, that operate not just on the scale of planets, but on the scale of stars and beyond. And as we continue this quiet exploration, we begin to move toward those deeper forces, toward events that unfold across vast distances and shape not just individual worlds, but entire regions of the universe. As this awareness settles in, that even a single planet can be shaped by slow and subtle forces, our perspective begins to widen once more, beyond the scale of worlds, beyond atmospheres and oceans, toward something larger, toward the stars themselves, because stars, for all their steady glow, are not permanent. They are long-lived, but not eternal. Each star follows a quiet life of its own. It forms, it shines, and eventually it changes, sometimes slowly, over billions of years, and sometimes in a way that feels almost sudden on a cosmic scale. Imagine a star, much larger than our sun. For most of its life it burns steadily, releasing light and warmth into the space around it. Planets may orbit it, life perhaps may emerge in its gentle glow. But as time passes, the processes within the star begin to shift. The balance that once held it steady slowly changes. And then, at the end of this long journey, something remarkable happens. The star releases an immense burst of energy, not as a sharp explosion in the way we might imagine, but as a powerful unfolding, a final release of everything it has been holding. For a brief moment, the star shines brighter than entire galaxies. Light spreads outward, across vast distances, not with intention, but with inevitability, a natural conclusion to a long and stable existence. This event is sometimes called a supernova, but the name, while dramatic, does not fully capture the quiet scale of what is happening. It is not simply destruction, it is transformation. The elements that once formed the star are scattered outward, carried into space, where they may one day become part of new stars, new planets, new forms of life. And yet, for any world nearby, the effect can be profound. The sudden increase in energy, the flow of particles, the shift in the surrounding environment can alter the delicate balance that life depends on, not necessarily in a single moment, but through a chain of changes that follow. Once again, not violent, but transformative. A reminder that even the most stable sources of energy eventually evolve, and in that evolution, the conditions for life can change. But stars are not the only forces at work. There are larger structures still, galaxies, vast collections of stars moving together through space, shaped by gravity and time. Our own galaxy, the Milky Way, is one of many, and like all galaxies, it is not still. It moves, slowly, gracefully, across the universe, and sometimes, over immense stretches of time, galaxies pass near one another, not in sudden collisions, but in gentle interactions. Two vast systems, each containing billions of stars, slowly drawing closer, Their shapes begin to stretch, stars shift in their paths, new patterns emerge. From a distance, it might look like two clouds blending together, not crashing, but flowing. It is important to understand that even in such encounters, the space between stars is so large that direct collisions are rare. Most stars pass by one another, quietly, without contact, and yet the overall structure changes. Gravity reshapes the system, orbits shift, new stars may form as gas clouds compress under these changing forces, and for any planets within these regions, the environment can slowly transform. The sky itself may change, new stars appearing, others drifting away, radiation levels shifting subtly over time. Again, not sudden, not catastrophic, but gradual, a slow reconfiguration of the cosmic landscape. And then there are objects even more difficult to imagine, not because they are rare, but because they do not emit light, they do not shine. They are known only by their influence, their presence, revealed through the way they shape the space around them. These are often called black holes, but even this name can feel heavier than the reality, because while they are powerful, they are also quiet. They do not reach out. They do not pull things in from great distances. They simply exist as regions where gravity becomes extremely strong, so strong that once something moves too close, it cannot return. Light itself cannot escape, but from a distance, a black hole is not a threat. It behaves like any other object of similar mass. Stars can orbit it. Planets could exist nearby, if conditions allow. It is only when something approaches too closely that its influence becomes unavoidable. And in rare cases, over immense spans of time, a black hole may drift, not rapidly, not unpredictably, but slowly through the galaxy, carried by the motion of the stars around it. If such an object were to pass through a planetary system, it would not instantly destroy it. Instead, it would gently reshape it. Orbits would shift, paths would change, and over time, the balance that once held the system together might be altered, not abruptly, but steadily. And in that steady change, conditions for life could shift beyond what is sustainable. What all of these scenarios share is not violence, but scale. They unfold across distances and times, far beyond human experience. They are part of the natural evolution of the universe, not directed, not intentional, but inevitable. And within that inevitability lies a quiet truth, that survival, even for a thriving civilization, is not only a matter of internal stability, but also of the environment in which it exists, because no world is completely isolated. Every planet, every system is part of something larger, and that larger structure is always changing, slowly, gently, but continuously. And so, as we reflect on this, the silence of the universe begins to take on yet another meaning, not just a question of presence or communication, but of endurance, of how long something can remain in a universe that never stands still. And yet, within this vast and ever-changing landscape, there is also another possibility, because if a civilization survives long enough, if it learns to understand these forces, then perhaps it does not only endure them, it begins to work with them. As this idea settles in, that survival in the universe is shaped not only by intelligence, but by the ability to endure vast and changing forces, another question begins to form, not about whether civilizations exist, but about what they might become if they last long enough. Because if a civilization continues, if it adapts, learns, and survives the many quiet challenges of its environment, then over time, it may begin to change in ways that are difficult to imagine from where we stand now. One way to gently explore this idea is to think in terms of energy, not as numbers or measurements, but as access. How much of the surrounding world a civilization can understand and use. At the earliest stage, a civilization lives within the limits of its own planet. It draws energy from its environment, sunlight, wind, water, heat beneath the surface. It builds systems, learns to store and distribute energy, begins to shape its world. At this stage, everything remains local, bound to the surface, to the cycles of day and night, seasons, climate. You might imagine this as a civilization learning to live within its home, understanding each room, each window, each source of light. Over time, if it continues to grow, something changes. It begins to reach beyond the surface, into space. At first, with small steps, satellites, orbiting quietly above, then larger structures, stations, habitats, systems that extend beyond the planet itself, and eventually, the civilization may begin to gather energy not just from its world, but from its star. This does not happen all at once. It unfolds slowly, gradually. As technology becomes more refined, as understanding deepens, as the need for energy grows, structures may begin to form in orbit, collecting light more directly, more efficiently, not as a single complete shell, but as many smaller pieces working together, a kind of quiet network surrounding the star. From a distance, such a system might appear as a subtle dimming, a soft alteration in the star's light. Not obvious, but detectable. A sign that something is interacting with the energy of the star in a deliberate way. If a civilization continues even further, it may begin to extend beyond a single star system, reaching outward to other stars, building connections, slowly spreading across its galaxy, not rapidly, not in a wave of expansion, but in a gradual, steady process, like seeds carried by a gentle wind, settling in distant places, taking root and growing. Over immense spans of time, such a civilization might come to understand not just individual systems, but the structure of the galaxy itself, how stars move, how energy flows, how different regions evolve. And with that understanding comes the possibility of influence, not control in the forceful sense, but guidance, working with the natural processes of the universe rather than against them. There are even more distant possibilities, not because they are likely, but because they help us stretch our imagination. Civilizations that move beyond the scale of galaxies, that begin to explore the deeper structure of the universe itself, the fabric of space and time, the ways in which distances can be understood, or perhaps reinterpreted. In such a view, movement might no longer mean travelling across vast distances, but finding ways to bring distant points closer together, like folding a piece of fabric so that two far apart edges gently meet. These ideas are still theoretical, quiet possibilities that arise from our current understanding of physics, but they offer a glimpse into how different the future might become. And beyond even this, there is another thought, that intelligence, over long enough periods of time, may change its form entirely, not disappearing, but transforming, moving away from physical structures towards something more abstract, systems of information, patterns of awareness, existing in ways that are not tied to a single place, not bound to a planet, or even to matter as we understand it. In such a case, a civilization might no longer be visible in the ways we expect. No structures, no signals, no clear signs. And yet, it would still exist, in a form that is quiet, stable, and perhaps far more enduring. This possibility may feel distant, even unfamiliar, but it carries a gentle insight. That intelligence is not fixed. It is not limited to a single path. It can evolve, adapt, and change just as life itself has done. And so, when we think about other civilizations, we're not only asking whether they exist, we're asking where they are along this path. Are they just beginning, like us, still learning to live within their home world? Or have they moved beyond that stage, quietly expanding into the space around them? Or perhaps they've continued even further, becoming something we would not immediately recognize as a civilization at all. And this may be another reason for the silence, because if civilizations change over time, if they move beyond the need to build, to signal, to expand in visible ways, then the universe may be filled with intelligence. That leaves very little trace, not because it is hidden, but because it has become something quieter, something more subtle. And as we continue this gentle exploration, another question begins to take shape. Not just what civilizations might become, but what they might feel like, what it would be like to exist in forms shaped by entirely different worlds, different environments, different histories. As this idea begins to settle, that intelligence may grow beyond the limits of a single world, beyond even the reach of a single star, the imagination opens a little further, not abruptly, not in a rush, but slowly, like a horizon expanding. Because if a civilization continues long enough, learns enough, adapts carefully enough, then it may begin to reshape not only its environment, but the very way it exists within the universe. Imagine for a moment a civilization that no longer lives on the surface of a planet, not because the planet is gone, but because it has simply outgrown the need to remain there. Instead of cities built on land, there are habitats gently floating in space, not drifting aimlessly, but moving in quiet, stable paths, orbiting a star. From the outside, they might appear as small, distant points of light, but within, they could hold entire ecosystems, open spaces, artificial skies, environments carefully designed to support life. Some of these habitats might rotate slowly, creating a gentle sense of weight, allowing inhabitants to walk, to build, to move as they would on a planetary surface. Others might exist in different configurations, adapting to the needs of those who live within them. There is something peaceful in this image, a civilization no longer bound by geography, no longer limited by the surface of a single world, but spread gently across space, like a constellation of its own making. And as such a civilization grows, its relationship with energy begins to change. It no longer depends on what reaches a planet's surface. It gathers energy more directly, more efficiently. Light from the star is collected, converted, distributed across vast systems, a quiet network sustaining countless habitats. But beyond even this, there are more distant possibilities, because stars, while powerful, are not the most extreme sources of energy in the universe. There are places where energy becomes far more concentrated, more intense, more difficult to approach, and yet more abundant. One such place is found near what we call a black hole, a region of space where gravity becomes so strong that anything passing too close cannot return. Even light, which usually travels freely across the universe, cannot escape once it crosses a certain boundary. But before reaching that boundary, something remarkable happens. Matter that drifts toward the black hole does not fall in immediately. Instead, it begins to circle, spiraling inward, forming a glowing ring of material, moving faster and faster as it draws closer. This ring shines brightly, not because of the black hole itself, but because of the motion, the friction, the energy released as matter is compressed and accelerated. It becomes one of the most energetic regions in the universe. Now imagine a civilization that has learned to observe this, to understand it, and eventually to use it. Not by approaching too closely, but by carefully positioning itself at a safe distance, harvesting a small portion of that energy, converting it into something usable. In this way, even the most extreme environments become part of a larger system, not something to fear, but something to work with. There is also another idea, one that feels almost like a gentle bending of reality itself, because distance in the universe is one of the greatest challenges. Even travelling at incredible speeds, moving between stars takes years, decades, or longer. But what if, instead of crossing distance, you could change it? Not by moving faster, but by altering the path itself. Imagine taking a sheet of fabric and placing 2 points far apart. Normally, to move from one to the other, you would have to travel across the surface. But if you gently fold the fabric, those 2 points can come closer together, not because the distance has disappeared, but because the path has changed. In physics, there are ideas, still theoretical, still uncertain, that suggest something similar might be possible, not in a simple or immediate way, but as a possibility, a way of connecting distant regions of space through carefully shaped paths. If such a thing could exist, it would not be a tunnel in the way we imagine, but more like a shortcut through the deeper structure of space itself, a quiet reconfiguration of how distance is experienced. These ideas are still far beyond our current abilities, but they offer a glimpse into how a civilization might continue to evolve, not just by building more or travelling farther, but by understanding the universe at a deeper level, and using that understanding and to move more gently within it. There is also a softer possibility that a civilization may not continue expanding outward forever, that at some point it may turn inward, focusing not on growth, but on refinement, on creating stable, balanced environments where existence can continue quietly for long periods of time. In such a state, a civilization might become less visible, less active in ways we can detect, not because it has disappeared, but because it has found a different way of being, one that does not require constant expansion, one that values stability, continuity, quiet presence, and from a distance, such a civilization might be almost invisible. No large structures, no strong signals, just a subtle, steady existence woven into the fabric of its surroundings. And so, as we consider these possibilities, the silence of the universe begins to feel different once again. Not empty, not hidden, but perhaps simply quiet in ways we're only beginning to understand, because intelligence, if it continues long enough, may not become louder. It may become softer, more efficient, more integrated with the universe itself. And as this thought settles gently into place, another question begins to rise, not about how civilizations grow, but about what they might feel like, what it would be like to exist as something shaped by entirely different worlds, different environments, different forms of life. As this idea begins to settle, that civilizations may grow, expand, and eventually become something quieter, more subtle, our attention shifts once more. not to structures, not to technology, but to something more immediate, more personal, life itself. Because before there are civilizations, before there are signals or structures or distant traces, there is something simpler, something that begins quietly, a living system, shaped by its environment. And if life exists elsewhere, it may not resemble what we know, not because it is strange, but because it has grown under different conditions, different skies, different gravity, different rhythms of light and time. Imagine for a moment a world covered entirely by ocean, no continents, no mountains rising above the surface, just water, stretching endlessly in every direction. The light from its star filters down through the upper layers, fading slowly as it descends into the depths. In such a place, life would not climb mountains or walk across open land. It would move with currents, drift, glide, swim. Structures, if they exist, would not be built from stone or metal, but grown, formed from living material, shaped over time. Communication, if it emerges, might not rely on sound carried through air, but on vibrations in water, subtle movements, patterns, changes in flow. And intelligence, if it arises, may not look outward toward the stars at first. It may look inward into the vast layered depths of its own world. Now imagine a different kind of place, a planet where gravity is stronger than what we feel on Earth, where every movement carries more weight, where the air is dense and the surface feels heavy. In such an environment, life would likely grow lower to the ground, compact, strong, built to withstand pressure. Creatures might not rise high or move quickly, but they would be steady, grounded, adapted to a world where energy must be used carefully. Now consider the opposite, a world with weaker gravity, where lifting from the ground requires less effort, where the atmosphere is lighter and movement is easier. In such a place, life might grow taller, more delicate. Structures could extend upward, reaching into the sky. Creatures might glide or drift, moving with ease through the air, not bound tightly to the surface, but existing in a more fluid relationship with their environment. And then there are worlds that orbit stars very different from our own, stars that emit less light, softer light, often in shades that would feel unfamiliar. On such a world, vision might develop differently. Eyes, if they exist, might be larger, more sensitive, or perhaps life would rely less on sight and more on other forms of perception. Sensing heat, movement, subtle changes in energy, because life adapts, not to what we expect, but to what is available. This idea is sometimes described as convergent evolution, not as a rigid rule, but as a gentle pattern, that similar challenges can lead to similar solutions, even on different worlds, even with different starting points. For example, the need to move efficiently through a fluid, whether water or air, often leads to shapes that are smooth, streamlined, balanced. The need to gather energy, to sense the environment, to respond to change. These are universal challenges, and so, in some cases, alien life might feel surprisingly familiar, not identical, but recognizable, a kind of distant reflection. And yet, there are also possibilities that move far beyond what we know. Life that does not rely on water, but on other liquids. Life that exists at temperatures much higher or lower than those on Earth. Life that moves slowly, so slowly that its changes are almost imperceptible. Or life that exists in forms not bound to solid structures at all. Patterns of energy, systems that shift, flow, reorganize, not fixed, but dynamic, not easily seen, but present. These ideas may feel abstract, and they are, but they serve a quiet purpose. They remind us that life is not limited to a single form. It is a process, an unfolding, a response to conditions, shaped over time. And so, when we imagine alien life, we're not imagining something completely separate from us. We're imagining something that shares a deeper connection, a common origin in the basic rule of the universe, chemistry, energy, time, and from those simple beginnings, an endless variety of expressions. There is also a more personal layer to this thought, because when we imagine life on other worlds, we're also imagining perspectives, experiences, ways of perceiving existence. What would it feel like to live beneath an endless ocean where light fades into darkness? What would it feel like to move through a sky where gravity barely holds you to the ground? What would it feel like to sense the world not through sight, but through patterns of energy or movement? These are not questions with clear answers, but they invite a kind of quiet empathy, a recognition that life, wherever it exists, is not just a structure, it is an experience, and in that sense, the universe may be filled not only with forms, but with perspectives, each one shaped by its world, each one unfolding its own quiet story. And as this thought gently settles, it brings us to something closer. Because if life can take so many forms, if intelligence can grow in so many different directions, then the question is no longer just about what exists out there. It begins to return softly to us, to what we might become, to how our own path may continue, as we step slowly into the larger universe. As this quiet reflection settles, that life may take many forms, that intelligence may unfold in ways both familiar and unfamiliar, the journey begins to turn gently inward, not away from the stars, but back toward ourselves. Because after all the questions we have followed, all the possibilities we've imagined, there is one that remains, not distant, not abstract, but immediate. What does all of this mean for us? If we're not alone, if somewhere across the vast distances we have explored, other forms of life exist, then one day, perhaps slowly, perhaps unexpectedly, contact may occur, not necessarily as a sudden event, not as a dramatic arrival, but as a gradual realization, a signal confirmed, a pattern understood, a discovery that something else is there. At first, such a moment would likely feel quiet, uncertain, carefully examined, tested, questioned again and again, because the implications would be profound, not only scientifically, but deeply human. It would reshape our understanding of our place in the universe, not as the only centre of awareness, but as one among many. And yet, alongside that possibility, there are gentle questions, not of fear, but of balance, because contact, even in its simplest form, carries consequences, not because it must lead to conflict, but because difference itself can be challenging. Imagine encountering a form of life that evolved under entirely different conditions, different senses, different ways of perceiving, different forms of communication. Understanding would not be immediate. It would take time, patience, a careful process of learning, of interpreting signals, of finding common ground. Even something as simple as meaning could be difficult to establish. A pattern that feels clear to one civilization may feel unfamiliar to another, and so contact would not be a moment. It would be a process, a gradual unfolding of mutual understanding. There are also other possibilities. Not all encounters are equal. If two civilizations differ greatly in their level of development, the balance between them may not be even. One may understand the other more easily, more completely. And this difference, even without harmful intent, can create challenges. History offers quiet examples of this. Encounters between societies at different stages of development have often led to change, sometimes beneficial, sometimes difficult. And so when we think about contact, it is not only about discovery, it is also about responsibility. How to approach something unknown with care, with respect, with an awareness of the impact that even a small interaction can have. There are also more subtle risks, not of conflict, but of disruption. Ideas, technologies, knowledge, introduced too quickly or without context, can alter a civilization's path, change its priorities, shift its balance. And while change is not always negative, it is not always easy, and so, even in a peaceful universe, caution may still be wise. There's also another possibility, one that is quieter still. That contact may not happen in the way we imagine, not through direct interaction, but through observation, through indirect discovery, finding traces, signals, patterns that suggest the presence of others without ever meeting them. In this case, the impact is different, more reflective, more internal. We do not need to respond immediately. We do not need to act. We simply know, and that knowledge alone can change how we see ourselves. But there is also the other side of the question, the one that is often left unspoken. What if we are alone? Not just temporarily, not just in this moment, but in a deeper sense. What if, across the vastness we have explored, life is rare, or intelligence even rarer? In that case, the silence is not something to explain, but something to understand, not as emptiness, but as uniqueness, a universe where awareness has emerged, at least once, here on this small world, orbiting a quiet star. At first, this idea may feel isolating, but there is another way to see it, not as loneliness, but as responsibility, because if awareness is rare, then it is also precious, something that carries value, not just locally, but cosmically. In such a universe, every thought, every question, every moment of understanding becomes part of something larger, a way for the universe to know itself. And this brings us to a final gentle reflection, because whether we are alone or one among many, the path forward remains. Humanity continues to explore, to learn, to expand. Perhaps one day we will move beyond Earth, establishing small, quiet settlements in space, adapting to new environments, new conditions. Over time, those who live beyond our home world may begin to change, not drastically, not all at once, but gradually, adapting to different gravity, different light, different rhythms, and after many generations, they may become something slightly different, still human, but shaped by new worlds. And if those paths diverge far enough, if different groups of humans adapt to different environments, then one day they may meet again, and in that meeting, they may not immediately recognize each other, not as separate species, but as variations of a shared origin, a quiet reminder that even we may one day become something that feels unfamiliar, and in that sense, the line between us and alien begins to soften, because alien life may not always be something distant. It may also be something we grow into. And so, as we reach the end of this quiet exploration, the question remains, not answered, but gently transformed. The silence of the universe may mean that we are early, one of the first to look outward, to wonder, to listen. Or it may mean that we are late, arriving after many others have come and gone, leaving behind only faint traces. Or perhaps it means something else entirely, something we have not yet imagined. And so we return, not with certainty, but with perspective, a deeper sense of where we are within this vast unfolding universe. And so we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open or you're already floating somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for being part of this little journey. If you'd like to join me again for more gentle wanderings, you're always welcome to subscribe or share this with someone who could use a peaceful pause. Time has a way of slipping through our fingers, but here, in this quiet moment, it's just you and the soft hush of rest. Sleep peacefully wherever and whenever you may be.